Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. There's a lot of talk about healthy eating these days. And if we listen to everything that we're told, we'll probably find we weren't eating anything, and we'd all get very hungry. And salt is one of the many things that we're told to cut down on. I can remember well from my childhood days the liberal amount of salt thrown into the vegetables as they were cooked, and then we had more on the side of our plates. We're encouraged to reduce salt in our diets now, and I certainly now wouldn't enjoy anything that was laced with salt as it was when I was a child. Yet it's the piquancy of salt in moderation which does in fact bring out the flavour in food and can add to an otherwise rather bland meal. And of course in Jesus' time, and even not so very long ago, salt was essential for preserving foods before the days of fridges and freezers. Jesus talks about us being salted with fire, and fire too is something which is alive, and depending on the circumstances, it can even bring a sense of panic if it's not an intentional burning. Jesus says, "Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." So how do salt and fire, which could perhaps be seen as an active state, fit comfortably with peace, which might be considered more passive? Jesus is our example of this, and it's in his life on earth that he showed us how to do this. Some of us may remember the old hymn which starts, "Gentle Jesus, meek and mild." So what picture does that bring to your mind if you think of Jesus in those terms? Meek and mild can imply submissiveness in a negative way. And although Charles Wesley may not have intended this when he wrote these words, when all three words, gentle, meek and mild, all come along together, it's too easy to interpret them as suggesting weakness rather than true humility. Jesus expressed his gentleness through compassion. His whole being was filled with God's love and compassion for every person and for the world which God had created. Jesus was gentle with people. He took a child in his arms. He laid his hands on a crippled woman. He touched the eyes of the blind man who asked for healing. Jesus' expression of meek and mild came through his inner strength of conviction that he was doing God's will when he submitted to the authorities in Gethsemane and allowed them to crucify him, without fighting back, without harsh words, but in the giving of his whole life for the sins of the world, our sins, so that our relationship with God could be restored through forgiveness when we say sorry to God. Jesus was not meek in the sense of being weak. Remember when he overthrew the tables of the money changers in the temple? That was hardly an expression of weakness, and those would have been solid tables, laden with coins, and the money changers would most likely have resisted his actions too. And in Matthew's Gospel, we read that immediately after this episode, Jesus was caring for the blind and the lame. One minute we have the activity which might be associated with the power of salt and fire, and then the next moment we have the contrast of the more passive activity, the peace and the gentleness to be found in healing. And I think it's this contrast which is brought together in Jesus' life that he was trying to get across to his disciples in telling them that they cannot live God's ways by being half-hearted. If something in life is getting in the way and leading them astray, then they needed to throw it out. He was telling them that their lives, as with our lives, have to be a complete whole, totally focused on doing God's will in both active and passive or peaceful states. Our focus is to be on doing God's will in every aspect of our lives, whether we are being driven by the Holy Spirit into standing up for human rights, joining the march, writing a letter, or fervent prayer, or if we are called to bring reconciliation between ourselves and others, in our families and our community, or in bringing relief, peace and joy into the life of any troubled person or situation. Whatever we are doing, though, we cannot be half-hearted. Jesus said, "If salt has lost its taste, how can saltiness be restored?" We can't be washed out and lacking in flavour. We are called to be lights in the world, sharing the light of Christ in our lives in every situation that we find ourselves in. It may be something as small as giving someone a cup of water. For Jesus, it meant giving his life on the cross. Whether the situation we are called into calls for the piquancy of salt or the placidity and inner strength and conviction of peace, there is nothing half-hearted about following Christ. Read the Gospels. They are full of the stories of Jesus, showing every facet of his life, lived as God has called him to. We will never live lives that are perfect, and neither did his disciples. But remember that Peter went on to build the church. And apart from Judas, they all went out to teach about Jesus after Pentecost, when they were all filled with the strength of the Holy Spirit to fulfill Jesus' calling to them, to make disciples of all nations, baptizing and teaching everything that Jesus had commanded them. For us, God calls us all to serve him in different ways, and it's for each of us to discern where he is leading us in our own individual lives today. Whether it's the SALT activity of marching in Trafalgar Square for human rights or justice, or bringing peace through reconciling a damaged relationship or calming a troubled neighbour, we are called to follow Jesus' example of doing this with all our hearts and minds and strength. Keep focused. Let's not be led astray from God's calling. It's been said, as we separate everyday life from religion, we are breaking up the unity and wholeness of life. As we separate everyday life from religion, we are breaking up the unity and wholeness of life. So let's keep that saltiness in our lives, so every part of what we do is flavoured with holiness. Just as the disciples were filled with the Holy Spirit, we too are all strengthened in our calling by the Spirit too. Amen.